It all comes down to this. 45 games played in League One so far, 46 once the games are completed this weekend. This is it. There's multiple teams with opportunities at madnesses, really. You've got Bolton Wanderers, who could complete an absolutely incredible comeback to finish in the automatic promotion places. You've got Derby County, who just need to secure a point versus Carlisle to secure their place in the Championship for the 2024-25 season. And then down at the bottom of the table, you've got a range of things which could happen, which could relegate Cheltenham Town, Burton Albion, or even Cambridge United. There's a lot to go through in this week's preview show for League One, so make sure you stay tuned, grab your popcorn, hit subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know your thoughts of your team heading into this weekend. Who do you think is going to get that automatic promotion place? We've got 9 games to go through in this video. We're going to be looking at Stevenage versus Cheltenham to start off with. We're going to be ending it with Derby versus Carlisle and looking at everything in between with the playoff battle and all that will be said and done on Saturday afternoon. So let's get into taking a look at the league table for this upcoming Sky Bet League One final game week. So ultimately, this is it. Derby County need a point. They face Carlisle. Bolton Wanderers need 3 points and a 4-goal swing. They need Derby to lose at minimum 1-0. They need to win 3-0. They face probably the one opposition they didn't want to face, and that is the team in 4th place, Peterborough United. Obviously, we're going to get into all the games in just a moment. We're going to be looking at all the games for realistically for the top 9 teams. Then obviously the games involving the relegation threatened teams, because I did a video on the playoff battle just a few days ago and the sacking of Neil Collins at Barnsley. Although not shocking based on results, the timing is a bit shocking. Now, ultimately, Barnsley, Lincoln, Oxford and Blackpool could all end up in the playoffs. There's 2 places up for grabs, and it's going to be interesting to see who takes those final 2 places. If we do now just scroll down to the bottom of this league table, you also have an opportunity where Cambridge could end up being relegated from League One. Now, a few weeks ago, I did personally say that I believe that they are safe in League One, and they have 47 points from 45 games. Ultimately, I said a point a game is safety, which you'd argue Burton are safe, but going into the final day, they aren't yet. Cheltenham Town face Stevenage, Burton Albion face Fleetwood, and Cambridge face Port Vale. Let's get into that first game of Stevenage versus Cheltenham Town, and let's see how it's all going to unfold. If you have not done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below or in this top corner. Let me know who your favourite team is in the EFL. Let me know who you think is going to get that final playoff place, and I'll let you now get back to the video. Now, ultimately, Cheltenham Town will come into this with bags of confidence. They beat Peterborough in midweek, and in my review show, I spoke about my disappointment in Peterborough because they did field a mega weakened side heading into that game. But Cheltenham Town took full advantage of that, scored 2 early goals and held on to their result in the end, winning 2-0. Now, Stevenage haven't been in the greatest of form in recent weeks and then lost their manager Steve Evans to Rotherham. Now, they are at home going into this game, but they do have nothing to play for. Now, if you do look at obviously the head-to-heads of these teams, it comes out in Stevenage's favour. 9 wins against Cheltenham to Cheltenham's 3 wins against Stevenage, and 2 draws in there as well. Obviously, these results date back a long time, and obviously you look at the result back in September of 2023, and Stevenage came away with all 3 points, winning 3-0. Now, Cheltenham Town started this season very slow, and ultimately I think that is going to be the thing which keeps them in, well, sends them down to League Two. Ultimately, they picked up, I think it was 1 point in 8 games. And ultimately, if they'd have just picked up 2 more points, they'd be sitting level with Burton. But that didn't happen. And they have to go into this game away from home, needing a win. And ultimately, they've won at Stevenage before on the 20th of April in 2021. So it's going to be interesting how they obviously handle this game. Obviously, we scroll down to the recent form, and neither side is really in incredible form. Obviously, Cheltenham Town picking up 2 wins out of their previous 5. Stevenage picking up 2 draws, a win and 2 losses. Ultimately, that Burton Albion win for Cheltenham Town was massive, but losing to Carlisle and losing to Lincoln City is ultimately going to be part of their downfall. Obviously, Stevenage, they sort of really fell off in the playoff race. And was it down to Steve Evans being talked up by Rotherham? Did he not want a playoff challenge with Stevenage? And obviously, that 1 win in 5 is ultimately what has cost them the chance at a playoff place. Obviously, losing to Burton Albion, relegation threatened Burton Albion, and losing to Exeter City. Obviously, I don't think Exeter City are a bad side, and Charlton neither are a bad side. But those results that Stevenage have faced have ultimately cost them a chance at the playoffs. And the big importance on this game is obviously focusing on Cheltenham, and can Curtis Davis aid Cheltenham in picking up a clean sheet on their way to a potential victory? Ultimately, it doesn't matter if Burton win. It doesn't matter if Cambridge pick up a point. But Stevenage, obviously, we see them higher up in the table in 9th place. Obviously, nothing to play for them apart from pride. They can't finish anywhere other than 9th. Now, they've had a brilliant season off the back of promotion to League One. Obviously, Leyton Orient, another team who were promoted last season. The other team, Carlisle, already relegated. They were massively punching above their weight heading into this season. And ultimately, it comes down to this for Cheltenham Town, and it comes down to this for Stevenage. Stevenage have nothing to play for. Cheltenham Town need to try and save themselves from relegation. And the next game, it's another big one in that relegation fight. We're going to do, obviously, the relegation games first, as Cambridge travel to Vale Park to face Port Vale. Obviously, Port Vale already relegated from the league, and Cambridge will go with probably some excitement going into this game. Ultimately, I do think that they are safe. Ultimately, I think it's between Cheltenham and Burton who goes down. I do think Cambridge will just sort of, I think they'll sneak a point at Vale Park ultimately. Now, Darren Moore, since going in at Port Vale, hasn't quite done the job that was anticipated of him. And if we look at the head-to-head of these two sides, it's 4 wins from Port Vale to 5 wins of Cambridge, with a draw in there as well. Obviously, both sides capable of beating each other. These results obviously go all the way back to 2020 and before. Ultimately, it's going to be a very, very interesting game. We spoke about Cheltenham and Stevenage and how ultimately I think Peterborough United field a weakened side to put Cambridge under pressure heading into the final game of the season. Ultimately, if Cambridge had have lost to Wycombe Wanderers in midweek as well, it would have made this game 10 times more difficult. But who's going to come out on top? Ultimately, it has to be Cambridge. If Cambridge want to stay in this league, they need at least a point. And if we look at the recent form of both sides, 2 points out of 15 for Cambridge and 1 point out of 15 for Port Vale. Ultimately, can you see past Cambridge in this one? Really, can you see past a draw? Who knows? It's going to be very tense in this game. Obviously, Port Vale have only got pride to play for. Cambridge are sort of playing for their place in League One. Ultimately, a win from Cheltenham would essentially put Cambridge down if they lost. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this game ends up. It's going to be very tight down there at the bottom. It's going to be very tense for those teams in and around. And ultimately, it could have been a madness at the bottom. You think if Port Vale had picked up 4 more points, Fleetwood picked up 4 more points along the way, we'd be going into the final day with 5 teams looking at potential relegation, but that didn't happen. So let's not talk about hypotheticals and let's get into the next game, which is Fleetwood Town versus Burton Albion. So Burton Albion travel to Highbury Stadium to face already relegated Fleetwood Town. Now, ultimately, Fleetwood Town, their stay in League One comes to an end this weekend, and I have to say, don't be sad that it's over. Be happy that it happened, because Fleetwood Town have been punching massively above their weight, especially in recent years. Last year, they took some incredible wins, and this year they've done the same. They've put on some really good performances in League One, but ultimately not quite enough to keep them in the division, especially recently, where they fell to some quite poor results, really, and especially those against the teams around them. And obviously, Burton Albion obviously know how that feels too, losing against Cheltenham Town just a few weeks ago, and they go into this game off the back of a fairly decent result against Reading. And if we do take a look at the head-to-head of both sides, it's 10 wins from Burton to 9 wins of Fleetwood, 2 draws in there as well, and one of them draws came back in the 23rd of September in 2023. Obviously, back last season, Fleetwood and Burton both took 3 points off each other. So ultimately, this is a game which could go either way. And ultimately, it's one of those where who's going to come out on top? The form is exactly the same. The 4-1 defeat from Peterborough was disappointing for Fleetwood, but it was just one of those things. Obviously, Burton Albion, 2-1 to Cheltenham, ultimately is the reason why they're not safe right now. A point, and they'd essentially be safe in that game, because obviously Cheltenham Town would have 2 less points. 4-0 defeat to Oxford. Oxford, a fairly decent side in this division. That is why they're punching for the playoffs, and both Fleetwood and Burton faced 4-0 defeats that day, but not that day, against the same team of Oxford. Blackpool beating Fleetwood 1-0 just a few weeks ago, but Fleetwood have picked up some good results this season. Unfortunately, not enough to stay in the division, but Burton Albion will be hoping to pick up a point. Ultimately, a point could see them safe. A win is absolutely necessary to secure safety, but a point could see them safe, and Burton Albion need to make sure they come away with 3 points in this game, just to make sure that it's impossible for Cheltenham to catch them up. Is that going to happen? Who knows? They've been very flippity-floppity under Martin Patterson, in my opinion, and ultimately I think at the end of the season it wouldn't surprise me if Patterson was moved on and they brought somebody else in, but ultimately I don't know the behind the scenes at Burton. It would be very interesting to see how they do handle that, and ultimately I think it's now time to take a bigger look at that playoff picture at the likes of Blackpool, Oxford, Lincoln and Barnsley, because at the end of the day, this relegation race speaks for itself. Burton have to win, Cambridge have to win, and Cambridge need a draw, and Cheltenham have to win. Ultimately, it's win or bust for those teams, because if you don't win, you're probably down, because each game is winnable for all 3 sides. So let's get in now to the playoff picture. Let's start off with Exeter versus Oxford. No. Let's start off with Reading versus Blackpool. Then we'll get into Exeter versus Oxford. Then Lincoln versus Pompey and Barnsley versus Northampton. So here we have it. It could be Karamako Dembele's last ride in a Blackpool shirt, unless they pull off the unthinkable and find themselves in the playoffs come the final whistle on Saturday. Now, they go to Reading, who fell to a 3-2 defeat at the weekend from Burton Albion. So they are a team who could lose. Obviously, Reading have nothing to play for. And ultimately, that's the bigger picture here. There's lots of teams in this division that now have nothing to play for, and I think that speaks a lot heading into this final day. Do I think Reading are going to go into this game not wanting to win? No. Do I think they might pull out of a few challenges? Probably, and Blackpool have got to take advantage of that. Ultimately, Blackpool put in a really good performance against Barnsley just a few days ago, and they're going to need to put on that type of performance again if they want to come out with all 3 points in this game and a potential playoff place. Now, if we go back to the 23rd of February, I keep saying February, 23rd of September 2023, 4-1 win for Blackpool at a 4-1 win for Blackpool at Bloomfield Road, and ultimately they've been very good at home, but not very good away. So, yeah, as I was saying, Blackpool, they've been brilliant at home. I think they're the 3rd best team in the league. And then away from home, they've really fell off the boil. Obviously, they put in a really good performance away at Pride Park in the EFL Cup early on in this season, but they obviously just haven't kept on those performances, and ultimately, that is what's cost them in the league this year. Obviously, Derby County were in a similar position last season. Didn't score a goal away from home in the first 12. Not 12 away games, 12 goals, 12 games in total. I think it was 12, 13 games in total. And ultimately, that's what cost Derby a playoff place in the end last season. Is it going to cost Blackpool again this season? Obviously, Derby went to Sheffield Wednesday on the final day. I think they needed just a point in order to get into the playoffs, and ultimately they lost, had a sending off. Controversial sending off, might I add, but ultimately doesn't make a difference. It happened, and this could happen to Blackpool. Blackpool head to Reading in need of 3 points. They have to win the game. And we look at the previous meetings between these two sides, obviously stretching between the Championship and League One. 6 wins to Blackpool, 5 wins for Reading, 2 draws between the two sides as well. And obviously, Blackpool can finish on a maximum of 76 points. The highest finish position is 5th. But ultimately, it all depends on teams around them. Now, Barnsley are in some treacherous form. They've picked up something like 12 points in their last 33, 36 points available. One win in their previous 6, which obviously, if you go further back, it's obviously one win in more than that. And obviously, you look at the recent form of the two sides. Reading, well, Blackpool, 4 wins in a row. Barnsley haven't won in a while. I know I'm talking about Barnsley and not Reading, and that's because that's an important thing heading into this fixture. And we'll get into Barnsley's game in just a moment. But ultimately, Blackpool need to go 5 wins on the spin to give themselves the best possible opportunity. Obviously, a point will not get them into those playoff places. They have to win. Their goal difference is much lower than that of Oxford, and that could cause a problem. But ultimately, a win on the final day gives them the best possible opportunity. If they win and miss out, they can go home happy. If they lose and miss out, and everybody else loses, they'll be defeated. They'll be devastated, and they'll be waving goodbye to Karamako Dembele off the back of. You'd probably say it's a successful season, but ultimately, when you're that close, it is unsuccessful. Obviously, we look at the form of the two sides in this game. Obviously, Reading picking up 1 win in 5. Blackpool 4 wins in 5. I think that just speaks volumes. Burton Albion picking up the 3-2 win against Reading at the weekend. Blackpool winning 3-2 against Barnsley. And Reading drew 2-2 with Barnsley. And their results, which have put Blackpool in this race. And ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Shall we take a look now at Exeter versus Oxford? They're the next team in this playoff race. Exeter City and Oxford, St James's Park. Oxford United won the return fixture 3-0 back in September. I finally got it right. I finally said September. And Oxford United do take the headline when it comes to head-to-head in this fixture. 7 wins to 3 wins, 4 draws between the two sides. Obviously, last season, Exeter really punched above their weight, really, in my opinion. Obviously, Oxford did beat them twice last season, once in the Cup, once in the league, scoring 4 times on both occasions. They won 3-0 back in September, but ultimately this is a game which could go either way. Now, Exeter City have nothing to play for. Oxford United have it all to fight for. They're only out of the playoffs on goal difference, but they'd need a 5-goal swing. Well, realistically, it's impossible for Oxford not to get in the playoffs if they win and Lincoln lose or draw. So ultimately, just like with the relegation battle, it's win or bust. And we scroll down to look at the recent form of the two sides before we talk about, obviously, the league table. Now, Oxford United did hit some good form. They won 3 games in a row, scoring 4 or more goals. And I think there's another one a bit further down as well in this list where they scored 4 or 5 goals again. Obviously, the 1-0 defeat to Lincoln City is ultimately, which is what's cost them at the moment, because if they'd have picked up a draw in that game, Lincoln City would be 3 points worse off, sitting on 71, and they'd be out of the playoff picture. Ultimately, they would be out of the playoff picture. And Oxford United, they drew with Stevenage. Although they had masses of opportunities to win that game, that's just how it happened. And obviously, Exeter City, a team with nothing to play for, have won 4 of their previous 5. Their only draw coming against Leyton Orient. They've beat Northampton, Port Vale, Stevenage and Cheltenham Town along the way. And ultimately, it's not going to be an easy game for Oxford. And I don't think Exeter will make it one. They're trying to prepare as best they can heading into the next season. And Oxford are trying to get into the playoffs. So both teams have something to play for. And it's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out. Ultimately, I gave my final verdict of what I think is going to happen in the playoffs in my playoff video just a few days ago. So make sure you do check that one out. I'll tell you again at the end of this video. So let's now take a look at Lincoln versus title winners Pompey. So we've got 4 remaining matches to get through in this game, in this video. I know it's a long one. Really glad if you're still here at this point. Amazing. Obviously, let me know your thoughts on the playoff race down in the comments. Ultimately, this is going to be difficult for Lincoln, but is it? Pompey are on the beach. They've won the title. They've got nothing to play for. They're not in any risk of anything, and they lost to Wigan the other day. Well, at the weekend, they lost 2-1 to Wigan, and it's going to be interesting how this one plays out. Obviously, Pompey, it's their last chance to play Abu Kamara. Obviously, some of their players may move on in the summer. Obviously, with the step up to the Championship, some of them might not be able to make that step up. Obviously, some of them will, some of them won't. It's going to be really interesting to see how this game is handled. Obviously, Lincoln City, as I said previous, it's win or bust. At home, in front of their home crowd, they'll make it a cauldron and they'll make it difficult for Pompey. Skubala's done that really well recently for a lot of teams. Obviously, in the playoff video that I did just the other day, I showed their form since they played Derby back, I think it was at the start of January, and we went back to when they played Derby in December. Obviously, Derby beat them 3-1 in December, and it was a completely different game when we played them away from home. And I did not expect that at all, did not expect the change in performance levels, but ultimately they found another level. And you look at the head-to-heads and it doesn't look good for Lincoln City, but ultimately they won't care. They know what they need to do. They need a win. They need to win at all costs. And ultimately, it's hard to really pinpoint things which need to happen in this game. But ultimately, they won't care if it goes in off a beach ball, if it goes in off someone's backside, if it's an own goal. They won't care if it's a dubious penalty. They just need to take away all 3 points. They do have the joy of that 5-goal difference on Oxford. So ultimately, all they need to do is match Oxford and they'll be ahead of them. But the problem with that is Blackpool. Obviously, Blackpool, they face Reading away from home, which will be a tough game for Blackpool. But ultimately, it's one that is winnable. And this game against Portsmouth, if Portsmouth put out their full strength side and actually try and play, I think Portsmouth will take a point, which is where I see a problem, because I think Blackpool will beat Reading. And I do think Oxford will win their game. I don't think Barnsley will win. And ultimately, I think it's going to be Barnsley in 8th come the end of play. And obviously, we're going to get into that Barnsley game in a minute, which I'll talk about, obviously, with their change of manager. But ultimately, Lincoln City's recent form is obviously very impressive. 3 wins out of 5. Just that one loss to Wigan Athletic. Ultimately, and ironically, it's the same result which Portsmouth had at the weekend. And obviously the draw with Reading, which shows that Reading can get a result, especially at home. So they could hold on to that. But ultimately, it's going to be difficult to see how this playoff race ends. And for me, I'll clip in what I said in that video, if I remember. If I don't, go back and check it out. It's only a few videos ago. I think it's about 15 minutes long. And I give my full verdict on these teams. Go through them all. Managers, form, everything. And ultimately, Lincoln City have a brilliant opportunity to go from nowhere to the playoffs in essentially 6 months. And it'll have been a brilliant turnaround for Skubala since joining in November. And ultimately, if they get in, I would probably put them potentially as favourites for the playoffs. Ultimately, the real favourites will be whoever finishes in 3rd, which will most likely be Bolton. But obviously, Posh have a good record in the playoffs. But Lincoln City's turnaround has been absolutely incredible. Let's now get into the Barnsley versus Northampton game, the final one. And I'll tell you why I believe Barnsley won't end up in the playoffs. So the final game where we're going to be talking about the playoffs, and then we'll get on to the automatic promotion race. Barnsley at home versus Northampton Town. They beat Northampton back in September, but ultimately, are they going to be able to do it again? Probably. They might win. It could happen. But ultimately, they've changed manager with a game to go. Now, ultimately, Neil Collins was not doing enough. 12 points in their previous 33, 36, something along them lines. I went into detail about it in that playoff video, which I was mentioning just a little bit earlier on. And ultimately, they've not been good enough. They won that game against Derby. They beat Wycombe the week after in an impressive 4-2 win. They drew with Bolton, and then that late goal from Bolton really sort of ruined any momentum which Barnsley had. And the only wins they've had since then is Burton Albion and Carlisle United, which I think speaks volumes to the level that this Barnsley team is playing at. Ultimately, they have a very good squad. They have some very, very good players like Devante Cole, John McAtee. And they've not done enough. They've got a midfield which a lot of teams in this league would die for, with Adam Phillips, Herbie Kane, Benson. Like, they've got some really good midfielders, and ultimately they've not been good enough. Now, the head-to-head on these two, obviously they've played twice, which is noted by FootMob. Obviously, a 2-1 win back in September, and then a game back in August of 2016, which we're not going to even entertain ultimately. And if you look at the recent form of both sides, Northampton are actually in the better form, and I think that speaks volumes of Barnsley's slump. They've picked up a point in 15, whereas Northampton have picked up 6 in 15, and Northampton aren't a relegation threatened side. If we do just scroll down, they are sitting in 14th place, but ultimately a mid-table side are outperforming them, and it's difficult to see a way for Barnsley to stay in those playoffs. Ultimately, if you'd have told me this after they beat Derby, I'd have laughed at you, because I genuinely thought Barnsley would end up... I thought the top 2 would end up being Peterborough and either Derby or Barnsley. I thought it all ended up sort of riding on the Derby versus Bolton game. Portsmouth at the time of that game were in sort of a bit of a slump of form, if I remember correctly. I think they didn't win in sort of like 4 or 5 games, but they weren't losing either. So they were still picking up points and sort of keeping that gap. And ultimately, Derby County are going to rue some missed opportunities in that away game at Portsmouth and in the home game against Portsmouth, because they could have been title winners ultimately, and that's just how it happens. Now, we are going to get into the automatic promotion race. We're going to get into Bolton's game versus Peterborough next, and then we're going to end off with Derby versus Carlisle. 2 final games to close out this bumper episode of a League One preview, and we start off with Bolton Wanderers travelling to Peterborough United. Now, ultimately, a midweek defeat for Peterborough ruled them out of the automatic promotion race. But will they care? Personally, I think they won't. I think Darren Ferguson ultimately shut themselves out of it a couple of weeks ago. I think it was just after they won the EFL trophy. I think Derby ended up a game ahead, and they were like 6 points ahead, and ultimately they put themselves out of the running, and they used the opportunity in midweek to rest some key players. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how they line up this weekend, because ultimately I don't think they're going to want to go into the playoffs off the back of defeat. In my opinion, I think this game's going to end in a draw. I think Bolton and Peterborough are both neither are going to want to go in the playoffs off a loss, but they'll go in off a draw and be happy. Now, Bolton obviously would need Derby to lose and to win 3-0. Derby would need to lose 1-0 and they'd need to win 3-0. Or Derby 2-0, 2-0. Like, you get what I mean. They just need a 4-goal swing. And ultimately, it's going to be difficult for Bolton to score 3-4 goals against Peterborough. Now, don't get me wrong, Peterborough concede goals. They have done. They conceded 2 against Cheltenham with their rotated squad. They conceded, I think it was 5 against Oxford just a few weeks ago. So ultimately, they can concede goals. They conceded 4 to Derby early on in the season, and ultimately, this is going to be difficult. I've obviously got my bias head on with Derby County. Like, we're going into this game needing a point, and Bolton need a 4-goal swing, and it's difficult to see where that's going to come from. But if you do look at the recent form of both sides, well, not even the recent form, recent results, let's say. Back on the 11th of February 2023, last season, Bolton won 5-0. But in the previous game, Bolton and Peterborough, the previous game this season, back in September, it was a 1-1 draw. Now, ultimately, these two sides are fighting for different things at this point. Now, Peterborough can only finish 3rd with a 7-0 win. So, that's not going to happen. Bolton can only finish 2nd with a 4-0 win. Well, a 3-0 win and Derby to lose 1-0. Is that going to happen? Bolton have only scored 4 once in their previous 5 games. Peterborough have conceded 4 once in their last 5 games. But ultimately, they score goals too. So, it's very difficult looking into this game, especially as a Derby County fan. Posh fans, Bolton fans, let me know down in the comments. What are you thinking heading into this? Is Darren Ferguson going to play another rotated squad to keep the likes of Clark Harris and Ricky J. Jones fit? is he going to chuck you back in full strength and sort of hope to go in with some momentum into the playoffs? Because ultimately that's what I thought you'd do with the Cheltenham game, and you haven't. Bolton, on the other hand, they recited themselves to the playoffs too, but ultimately they do have a chance at automatic promotion, and you can't just ignore that. And for me, if Ian Evatt goes into this game sort of not looking at the opportunity for automatic promotion, I think the Bolton fans will be very disappointed. But ultimately, Derby need a point. A point seals the deal. I previewed the Derby game in a video yesterday. We're going to take a brief look into it in just a minute as well. But ultimately, Bolton need to win 3-0. 3-0 at minimum, because the only way that they can go up with Derby is Derby losing, and they have to lose by 1. So ultimately, Bolton have to win. And I think it's just a lot of going around in circles in this video, especially with the playoff race, with this automatic promotion race, because it's difficult to see past Bolton beating Peterborough if they play a weak side. But if they play a strong side, it's difficult to see either team coming out on top, because they're both very good sides. They'll cancel each other out. Derby cancelled Bolton out. And ultimately, Peterborough absolutely battered Derby at Pride Park on New Year. And ultimately have ended up out of it in grand scheme of things. They have. And it's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out over the 90 minutes. Because if Derby go 1-0 down, it's going to change the whole perception of this game for Bolton. If Derby go up, it changes the perception of the game for Bolton. So, for me, it's going to be very difficult, whatever ground you're in, across League One, really. Like, there's lots to play for lots of teams. There's, you've got 2 for automatic promotion. You've got 4 for the playoffs. You've got 3 for relegation. There's a lot to play for in this league at the moment. Let's take a brief look into the final game then. Derby County versus Carlisle at Pride Park Stadium on Sky TV. If you do want to see my full preview of this game, check the previous video on this channel. Posted it either this morning or yesterday. I'm not sure if I'm posting this on Friday or Thursday evening. So make sure you stay tuned to the channel to keep up to date with all my latest content. Obviously, Saturday we'll have a match day vlog of this game. Whatever happens, win, lose, draw, promotion or playoffs, the video will come out and we'll talk about it. I'll give you my opinions and we'll see what happens. But this, for me, I said it in my preview. If you haven't watched it already, make sure you do. If Derby can't beat Carlisle or draw or get a point against Carlisle on the final game of the season, already relegated Carlisle, then they do not deserve automatic promotion. Now, if we end up losing and still getting automatic promotion, whatever, I'll take it. But ultimately, if Derby can't pick up at minimum a point against Carlisle United on the final day of the season, at home, like, it'll be a devastating result for Paul Warne, for the squad, for everybody if they end up falling into 3rd place. Now, ultimately, you wipe yourself down and you'll go again for the playoffs, but you look at the head-to-head of the two sides, Derby have never lost. Now, the 3 games which FotMob have, obviously, the League One game from earlier in the season, which Derby won but weren't really at the races, and then obviously the 2 cup games from a long, long time ago. Very, very different squads. And you look at the recent form of 2 sides, obviously Derby in the better form. But ultimately, this game should mean nothing for Derby. Like, ultimately, Derby should have picked up 3 points at Wickham. They should have picked up 3 points at Northampton, and they didn't. And it comes down to this, and this is the final weekend of League One, and it could be Derby's final weekend of League One, maybe for a season, maybe for 10 years, maybe forever. Who knows? But it's an emotional time as a Derby fan because we've been through such a lot. Like Bolton and Pompey have over their history, but especially Derby in the past 2 years. Well, 3 years really. 2020 really, it all kicked off with the 2020 with restrictions. 2021 administration. 2022 being bought. 2023 pushing for that promotion rebuild with Paul Warne. 2024 sealing the deal back to the Championship. Is it going to happen? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. But ultimately, we need a goal. Nathaniel Mendez-Lang, Louis Sibley, Craig Forsyth, get on the pitch. Martin Waghorn, get a goal by any means necessary, and ultimately come away with a win, so it doesn't matter what happens in any other game. So I do hope you've enjoyed this League One preview roundup that I've been doing, especially over the past few weeks. Seen a massive influx of viewers and subscribers on the channel, and I really appreciate the support. As I'm recording this, we're currently sitting on 498 subscribers. So if you are enjoying the content and want to stay tuned for upcoming Derby County and whatever league Derby County content are in next season, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Like the video, let me know in the comments who your favourite team is, and I'll catch you in the next video. Make sure to go and find me on TikTok, pictured here, and Twitter, pictured here. These are the places where I'll keep you all up to date with all my upcoming videos and my thoughts and feelings around the Formula 1 and football weekend.